Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Flaherty, and I'm currently a graduating senior graduate student at U of L in the Bioethics and Medical Humanities Department. I am pursuing a doctorate in neuropsychology, and that entails a lot of work with dementia patients and families. And my partner in this project is pursuing a medical degree and is also interested in this subject. So we wanted to create something that would help the community. So I'm going to be gearing my discussion towards the caregivers, patients, and families of those who are diagnosed with dementia. So I just want to go ahead and get started. Basics. What is Alzheimer's disease? As I'm sure you guys are already very well versed in the definition. But if you go to the Alzheimer's Association, they give you a ton of useful information, and I'm sure everybody has probably already sought this information. But basically, it's a progressive disease that destroys memory and other important mental functions. So I guess the next question for a caregiver or a family member, and especially the patient, is how do you prepare for this disease? What do you do as a family member? And there's a number of different answers to that. So I think something that's often understated, but incredibly useful, is educating yourself. And sometimes educating yourself without the authoritative figure of a physician or a psychologist or somebody else that's telling you from their experiences or what they read in their textbooks or, the empirical information. Sometimes learning things for yourself and doing your own research gives you insight into things that you may not otherwise have. So there's multiple resources. I absolutely want to make sure that I make it sound incredibly imperative that you consult professionals, and I don't just mean your neurologist. I'm also talking about psychiatrists, geriatricians, which a lot of people may not be familiar with that term, but it's basically a clinical psychologist that specializes in geriatrics. So they'll have a wealth of knowledge on this topic alone that a lot of physicians may not even have, because what they see and treat the most, and in their training they receive education that is greatly centered on the cognition and affects of people who are dealing with neurological diseases. That especially affect older generations. Okay, so occupational therapists. These people will be your best friend. Primary care physicians, of course, and of course, neurologists. You should also consider sources that might help you come up with effective coping strategies for yourself and for the loved one, family member, that you are caring for, that you're concerned about. Particular examples would be not only just doing your own research on PubMed.com or PsycInfo.com, which these are academic journals. These are empirically based journals that give you information that is statistically as sound as it gets at this point, but also seeking things like support groups. These are often found. You can find them on the Alzheimer's Association website, but they're often found in people's churches and communities and stuff like that. Support groups for family members dealing with this, and also the patients themselves. I think that is often overlooked, although it's crazy that it is. But there's a lot of resources out there available. I would even suggest attending certain talks seeking out certain people who specialize in this or have gone already. But more where that came from. We'll move to the next. Okay. So when people hear Alzheimer's disease, you automatically get this certain feeling that, kind of incites dread in your spirit. It's not just a disease. It's not just a neuropsychological disease. It comes with a lot of social implications and biases that you'll only find with this disease, actually, or other forms of dementia. Usually if we're not educated on the subject and we aren't incredibly familiar with the realities of this disease, the first thing that pops into our head, there are things that we hear from other people, movies, things that we see based on media, and we automatically have a horrible sense of sorrow, maybe even a sense of fear for ourselves, for our parents. So we got to understand that this isn't just, a physiological disease that is going to impair memory and function in that person. It's going to extend to their social circle and their family, because it does carry a lot of prejudice, believe it or not. Okay, so this makes it important to consider the social context, so that you can understand your own reactions, where they came from, and even more importantly, understand the reaction and the feelings of the patient. I mean, imagine being the one to receive that news. So when we talk about social biases, I'm sure there's plenty, but we're talking about elderly associated biases. So what do we mean by elderly associated biases? So one thing that I should mention is that bioethics and medical humanities is steeped in healthcare, obviously, but it's cross-listed with philosophy. So a great portion of our mission in our education is talking about philosophical, social implications of certain things. So when you think of an elderly person, there's a picture that comes to your mind. There's a picture of somebody, walking really slow in the grocery store, somebody who can't hear you when you talk, so you assume you need to speak slower and you need to speak louder. You think about people who maybe don't have much to do, don't really feel like doing anything. Maybe people who play bingo. Maybe people who aren't really aware of their surroundings, very fragile. These are all things that we associate with them. And although there might be some validity for some people sometimes, these stereotypes bring about certain thoughts of these people. There's a tendency to kind of consider them as non-persons anymore. They can't really produce for society. Their kids are grown. They can't hear you. Whatever thoughts come to mind. They don't really know what's going on around them. Maybe they're not happy, whatever. These are inaccurate stereotypes, and it has more of an effect than you would think when regarding people that are of older age. When you have those notions about any person whatsoever, no matter the race, age, nationality, it carries with it certain behaviors. You tend to ignore them more, or baby talk, or just assume certain things about them. Maybe not invite them. Maybe they're invisible. So that obviously is very important. Cognitive mental illness associated biases. We all know that people who have been diagnosed with mental disorders, they carry a heavy burden of stigma. This is something that permeates all of society. We all know it. We all know somebody that has been. So when we hear words like bipolar or addiction or depression, these are like dirty words in our society, and we often frown upon the people who suffer from these illnesses, and we regard them as weak, maybe weak-willed, lack of self-control, um, troubled, disturbed, all these other things that come, that maybe they have a bad childhood, or they're victims of this or that, or what have you. So it carries with it a large weight. And so if you can just imagine the summation, the intersection of those two biases, that's often what people that are suffering from any certain neuropsychological disease will experience. Primarily, we're talking about dementia, so that carries with it an additive of they can't remember, which brings a lot of consequences. Okay, so I've already gone over a few of these biases and what I mean by that, but they have consequences. This isn't just, oh, well, we think bad about, these certain groups. It brings along an ease at which people can, I guess, experience or tolerate or commit certain forms of abuse, whether it be in nursing homes or even within their own household, negligence, or outright abuse. So I've already gone over the idea of non-persons. There's this idea in the philosophy world that, one might have personhood, and what that means is sort of like your basic core, your basic spirit, or however you want to conceptualize this, who you are, what you like, how you react to things, how you feel, what your mannerisms, your affect, your stamina, all these things that are unique to you. There's a theory of essentialism that it's essential to your being and it is only unique to you. And that we have a tendency to think of people that have gotten older as less than that. They have lost that. And that's troublesome. That's troublesome, especially when we talk about autonomy and, end of life decision making and stuff like that. That definitely plays a big role in the trouble that can come from the disease. So when you think of somebody that has been diagnosed with a form of dementia, that we expect certain behaviors because of what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've read, notably, maybe even the movie The Notebook. I know a lot of people are thinking it, so I'm just going to say it. The Notebook. I'm not going to say it's a bad representation. I'm just going to say it's just one. So anyway, so one of the things that's expected from these people is disengagement. All of a sudden, they want to be alone, isolated, and they've lost their identity, and they've lost their relationships with others in the outside world. And the good example here is mom isn't mom anymore. Part of this could be a coping mechanism for the family, and maybe it helps them dissociate from the person that they remember. It helps them keep their mom preserved in their mind as that young, youthful, vibrant person who was very quick-witted and snappy with memory and everything like that. And so maybe it's to preserve that image in their own mind and to kind of go ahead and embark on the mourning process for them, but you don't realize really what that could do to another person. In like a metaphysical way, there is a theory that I might study later on in my career, that the more that you disengage, or the more that you start to treat somebody being invisible, do they actually start then to fade away as a causal effect? These are things that, are questions, and it does have an effect, If people stop looking at you, if stop asking you what you want, instead ask another person. If people talk like you're not in the room anymore and you're sitting right there, these things weigh heavily on anybody's psyche of any age whatsoever. So some of these things about personhood, the changing self, human essentialism, these things, we don't know if it's true. These are just, philosophical theories. But even if any of them are true or partially true, it is very important for people in contact with dementia patients to take notice of your own biases, and how they can seep through to. So if you go to the Alzheimer's Association excuse me, website, they have many, clips from people that have been diagnosed. And I'm not sure if they have them in movie format or if it's just written format, but I have a few available. You can read them at your own discretion. There's Eileen's story clip, diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the fall of 2006, had to retire from her job a few years ago prior, because of the symptoms and the physical issues. And with all the medications and the symptoms, things are not, good. It is an accelerating disease, and it does affect the family. We don't want to minimize their pain. What is important to take note of is not necessarily these symptoms in this clip, but what I want to bring to the forefront is certain parts of this clip. How certain parts of her disease, certain symptoms make her feel more self-conscious. Out of 55 years of life, I've only lived 19, and how it's a horrible way to live, but they kind of, as a family unit, want to keep giving for research and to help other people, which is something that I also wanted to mention in terms of the slide before, talking about coping mechanisms, how to deal with these psychological ramifications of finding out that your loved one is diagnosed. This is often an outlet for many people. But we want to keep in mind that the things that are said about these populations, the symptoms that affect them socially, make them more self-conscious, more anxious. And as we all know, anxiety is something that comes along with this disease as it progresses. So whether or not it comes along with this disease from an organic biological standpoint of the disease, or whether it comes along with it because of the trepidation of the future or what other people think or being self-conscious, that is a really good question, to consider. Account. It's Ted's story clip. Again, you can find all this on the webpage, but again, talking about how it has changed his life. It will impact society because it's going to affect more and more of the elderly population, but something I need to point out is it doesn't just affect seniors. We associate that with older people, but people can be diagnosed with this in their 40s. So we really need to start getting rid of that notion. But just the idea of a future medication or a future cure or people wanting to help sometimes gives people what they need. A common thread that you're going to find with most accounts, first-person accounts of people suffering from dementia, is their reliance on family. And I don't mean just to help them, with the symptoms and with the daily things that they need help with. I'm talking about their emotional reliance on their family. That right there, although it is very down the stream of common sense, shows you how important family and caregivers' attitude towards them is in terms of the progression of their disease, how they handle it, the maintenance of the disease, and their future. It is not set in stone that these patients are going to have a horrible, future, and the outlook is just grim. That is what we know now. That is a natural feeling, but that doesn't have to be that way. And I think a lot of people will tell you that it doesn't have to be that way. And there's some ways that you can prevent that from happening. But first, the people that are closest to these patients have to deal with their own ideas of this disease, their own feelings, their own psychological ramifications, whether they come down with anxiety or depression, or how they feel about it. Because when you're in a close relationship with almost anybody, you reflect things back to that person. And they can read very well. They may be diagnosed with this disease, but they are not dumb. They can read and feel everything. And so they perceive. So this is important to remember. So the first step, I believe, I've already kind of accomplished is bringing about a critical awareness, so that we can all be aware of these things, these biases we have. And I'm not just talking to caregivers and families and even patients that might have their own biases towards themselves. I'm talking to society as a whole, anybody. And the more you know about these premeditated thoughts of dementia and how it might affect people at a social, societal, personal, familial, biological level, the more you might be willing to take a step back and rethink, your framework. So yes, I guess we need to be aware of and challenge these biases for the good of these people. And I think I've already gone through a lot of them. Let's see, they're not really the same person, or they're not real persons anymore. They're just kind of like a shell. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they want. They don't know what's going on around them. They don't know what's best for them. That right there is a huge problem when talking about these patients, especially when it comes to advanced directives, living wills, and just any end-of-life wishes that are relayed to family members, because sometimes in the latter stages of this disease, wishes may change and people might have their own, I don't want to say selfish desires not to let go, or likewise, on the other hand, to let go, and they might use the disease against the patient and say things like, they don't really know what's going on, they don't know what's best for them, and, you should listen to me, basically. I know what's best for them. I knew them back when they were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and I know what they would really want if they were still here. It doesn't really work like that. So anyway, they, like I said before, talking about them like they're not in the room, but they're right there, makes people feel invisible. And because they can't produce, or they're not raising their children anymore, or, they can't go run marathons, or, whatever society values, if they cannot fulfill our particular values, then, there's a tendency to devalue them. They're not as worthwhile as another person, or better yet, another patient that might be in that nursing home, that might be in that hospital, that might be on the application waiting list. These are very important things. What effects do they have? This is what is still probably primarily going to be under investigation. That's what we do. And actually, I think research in this particular field will give us a plethora of information on how to treat this disease effectively, even more so than we are now, actually. So some of the effects, sometimes consistent negative influences against these affected persons. They pull others and these affected persons into negative views of Alzheimer's patients or themselves. And also, it encourages disengagement of the patient, which is, according to research, just beyond the worst thing to do. I think later in the slides, we'll actually briefly just talk about some research that has been done that show that disengagement and isolation and perceived feelings of loneliness in dementia patients greatly affects their prognostic outlook. It greatly enhances the symptoms of the disease, and it's just not recommended. Although the contradictory thing is that people, sometimes when they find out that someone has been diagnosed with dementia, they encourage disengagement. And, there's probably a bunch of different motivations behind this behavior, like the coping mechanisms and mourning process that I spoke of before, but also this idea of inevitable dread that, you're just slowly slipping away and you're going to be leaving soon. And so you might as well just quit now. Just focus on being sick, which is very strange. Yes, so that definitely works against therapy and maintenance of the self. And these diseases, being yourself requires active maintenance. Whereas in your younger years, disease-free, you're more growing into yourself, and it may seem kind of effortless, you learn new things through bumps in the road and what have you, and you learn new things about yourself. It seems more effortless, but for these populations, they have to actively fight against growing out of themselves. So actively working against these stereotypes and these expectations is the first and best way to challenge these biases, perhaps change them for future generations. Okay, so how might this affect caregiver surrogate reporting of the Alzheimer's affected person to healthcare team? Let's see. So I think that anybody who becomes comfortable with the idea of devaluing the human worth of any individual, it opens up a doorway that can be dangerous. Actually, it would lessen the quality of care for any individual that requires care. So higher caregiver burdens has been shown to negatively bias caregivers, and they report lower quality of life ratings for the patient. This is interesting research. That sometimes the anxiety and fear of the caregiver, because it is a full-time job and they often have to give up a lot. Time with their own families, a job of their own where they are being compensated, their own life experiences, things like that. So that requires a lot of patience, and usually these people kind of accumulate all this responsibility and anxiety, sometimes resentment and misunderstanding, and the more they feel anxious, the more they feel hopeless, or the more they experience illness that might be stress related, the more they have been shown to report lower quality of life for the patient. So it's weird. It's like they project their own negative perception onto the patient as well, sort of like along the lines of, well, I feel this way, so you must feel this way too, or even worse. Anyway, so that's one thing. Unfair categorization that may promote heavier cognitive restrictions than necessary. So when we talk about loss of personhood or being invisible or disengagement, isolation, quitting activities or hobbies that they once thought were fun, deviating from routine, that is an area of future research. Do these things make the disease worse? Worse than it would be, without the presence of these unfair categorizations? Does it make the cognitive decline accelerate at a faster rate, especially for early to mid-stage patients? Latter stage patients, sort of a different ball game, but early to mid-stage patients, it's a very malleable time. So that's an interesting. So, we've talked enough about the problems. What are the ways to better support a loved one affected by this disease? I've gone over a few things, but before I go over the things on the slide, I must mention again the overwhelming importance of challenging your own self before you step in to try to help somebody else or to be a caregiver or to give advice. You need to definitely examine your own thoughts about this disease. And for every person, that's going to be a different process. So, for someone like myself, if I, were to be handed this disease, or if rather a family member or parent of mine would be handed this disease, I would need to take time before I stepped up to the plate to analyze my own framework of thought. And that would involve probably going home and writing down my first, it's called associative task. You hear a word and you write down the first, 10, 15 words that come to mind right away without even thinking when you think of it. And from those list of words, however many you choose, you can already see your and it could be any word we're talking about, not just Alzheimer's. If somebody says wants to do an associative task on basketball players, the first things that come to mind usually are things that are so deeply ingrained in us that haven't really required much reasoning for us to come up with. They're just, quick responses. Those are the things you need to pay attention to, because those are the things that are going to be hardest for you to A, recognize because they're so deeply ingrained, and B, work against. And they do seep into your everyday interactions with anybody. So for me, that would be helpful. And then after I realized what my biases were, it would be along the lines of doing as much research as possible, attending support groups, whatever spiritual counseling you would be comfortable with, if any, things like that. Maybe participating in helping other people. I think exposure is the best cure for anything. Ignorance related. So if you are unfamiliar with this, it will be a great shock. But doing those little things can be of great help. And I think the more people that you meet that work with Alzheimer's patients or all are Alzheimer's patients, the more stories you're going to hear. And there's a variety out there. There's some people out there that have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and they can maintain the happiest, most jovial outlook for their future. Just getting a variety of responses. So, after working on yourself, it's important to understand the importance of autonomy. In the beginning of the slideshow, there's some important definitions. I can't remember if autonomy was one of them or not posted up there, but it's basically the ability to direct one's own life, make one's own decisions when talking about one's own body, mind, future, actions, and even with patients that are diagnosed with a disease that tells you that they won't be able to remember things for very long, it is still more than important to preserve their autonomy, because that is the core of, that's part of maintaining the self. Second thing I mentioned also here is end-of-life care. Advanced directives, living wills, these are things that everybody should fill out, and not just once, because we all change. I'm sure nobody listening to this, including myself, is the same person that they were 10 years ago. So your wishes will change, your values will change, your personality, things will change with time. And it goes the same for these patients. So, whether it be every 5 years or every 10 years, there should be something in writing that gives direction to people who are going to be put in charge of making these decisions should, things turn for the worst. So it's important to review them frequently, especially with Alzheimer's disease, because the nature of the disease is that it is accelerating faster than normal aging cognitive decline. So when there is a diagnosis, it's important to go ahead and start that conversation, as dismal as it may be, because that's your window of opportunity to kind of get some insight into their autonomous, wishes, their directions for their future. So why do these things help? I mean, some of it is sort of common sense, but the fulfillment of a person's already declared interest decreases the moral, emotional, and legal burden on the caregiver and the healthcare team, who might be charged with the duty to make their best educated guess, and that duty is a very heavy burden to bear. We're talking about life and death and things like that. So sometimes these decisions are not reversible. So psychological support for caregivers and families. This cannot be stated enough. I know it is very weird to seek help, if you feel like you don't need it from a psychologist, but we're working actively against that stigma. And this is a very, it's a life-changing event. It's a life-changing diagnosis. So anyway, it's very important, very useful, especially when talking to those doctors that specialize in this particular realm. You're not going to get any more knowledgeable than that. So they can help to teach you to be able to discern behaviors from the Alzheimer's patient, separate the disease-influenced behavior and normal reactions. So when we're talking about being upset, angry, anxious, sad, afraid, some of these things are incredibly normal, and if they were not experiencing this, that would be maladaptive. But because they have this diagnosis, there's a tendency for people to say, oh, well, that's just because they have Alzheimer's, it's making them this way. And don't be too quick to say that, because although psychological affects do accompany this disease, you must be informed on how to judge what is a normal reaction that anybody would have and what is disease related. Don't be so quick to just attribute everything to the disease. So ethical controversies centering around competency, incapacity, autonomy. These things are primarily legal terms, and so the controversies that, namely the ones that will come to mind when talking about these legal terms of competence or incapacity, is the advance directives. Sometimes things happen in any stage of Alzheimer's, but in the latter stages, things happen. Heart attack, stroke, whatever it may be. And it may not necessarily end the life, but it might put them in a state that they never wished to be in. And that's when the advanced directives come in. The healthcare team will refer to these documents and say, well, this is what they said they wanted. Sometimes it will be undisputed by families or caregivers. Sometimes it will be disputed. And that's where these ethical controversies come in mind, because somebody might say, well, they were demented when they wrote that, when they signed that, so it's no good. That is an ad hoc argument to make. It is not always true. It's not always a valid argument, especially depending on the context of the signing and everything like that. So there's many things that go along with advanced directives. But anyway, you've learned something. I hope that maybe there's a sense of hope and of a future, a better future. And there's a lot of people out there that know how to help and want to help. And so, don't be afraid to seek those resources. Thank you for listening.